Thanks a lot, Luigi. Delighted to be here. We'll be discussing this paper, The Illusory Promise of Stakeholder Governance, joined with Roberto Tallarita. So the motivation for people in this conference, you don't need to say much. Everybody knows that there is growing support for quote unquote stakeholderism. This is the term we use for the view that corporate leaders should give weight to the interest of stakeholders and not just of those of shareholders as an independent end when they make decisions. And the growing support is exemplified by the Business Roundtable statement, by the Davos Manifesto, the Larry Fink letter to CEOs, and so forth and so on. We make two complementary points. First, we argue that the benefits of stakeholderism, the purported benefits, are illusory. Stakeholderism should not be expected to benefit the stakeholders in the way that it is alleged to be. And second, not only it's not going to produce benefits, but the perils of stakeholderism are considerable, and accepting stakeholderism would impose substantial costs, including on stakeholders themselves. And therefore, we conclude that stakeholderism should be rejected, including, and this is an important provision, including by those, and we count ourselves in this group, who take stakeholder interest seriously. So a word about Milton Friedman. Everybody here is referring to his seminal essay. We differ from him in some key respects, but agree with him on others. If you read Milton Friedman's essays, you get a sense that capitalism works quite well, thank you. And we don't accept this view. We think that corporate externalities are a major problem, and we need to think seriously about how to address them. But we do conclude in this paper that stakeholderism is not a useful, and indeed is a counterproductive remedy. And here we agree with him on some attitude to corporate leaders. There are two versions of stakeholderism. One, enlightened shareholder value. Under this version, the emphasis is that corporate leaders need to recognize that treating stakeholders well is useful often for long-term value maximization, and therefore they should take it into account instrumentally. They should take stakeholders into account instrumentally as a means to shareholder value maximization. And we argue in the paper that this version of stakeholderism is conceptually and substantively not different from shareholder value maximization, and doesn't lead to any different operational corollaries. The more important version of stakeholderism, what we call pluralistic stakeholderism, is one that treats stakeholder welfare as an end in itself rather than as a mere means, and calls on corporate leaders to balance different independent objectives and interests. This is an approach that was followed by the Constituency Statutes that were adopted by many US states, and more on them later. A few words about the BRT statement. we are celebrating also its 1-year anniversary. We are asking the question of whether it was a signal of meaningful changes to come or merely a public relations move. There were many in the media and elsewhere, not everyone, that described this as a major milestone, a major philosophical shift, breaking with decades long held orthodoxy, a potential sea change. But we put forward evidence that suggests that the statement was mostly for show and not a signal of coming major changes. We give 5 pieces of evidence in the paper. Let me mention here, put on the table 2 of them. One is we contacted the public relations offices of all the companies whose CEOs signed the statement and inquired whether this joining the statement was approved or ratified by the board. And this is something that one would expect to happen for corporate decisions that are major. We were told that except in one case, the CEOs all signed the statement without seeking board approval, which is consistent with their perceiving joining the statement as not requiring any meaningful changes in how they are going to treat stakeholders. Second piece of evidence, we reviewed all the board approved and frequently updated corporate governance guidelines of all the public companies that joined the statement. And we found that to this date, those guidelines largely reflect a commitment to shareholder primacy. To give just one example from the guidelines of JP Morgan Chase, its CEO, Jamie Dimon, chaired the BRT when the statement was issued. And those guidelines state very clearly that the board is supposed to manage the company on behalf of the firm's shareholders. But putting aside the intentions and plans of the CEOs of the Business Roundtable, let us focus on the bigger and more general question. Should we expect stakeholderism to produce benefits for stakeholders beyond what would serve shareholder value? Financial economists would view this question and the answer to it depending in turn on the following question of whether corporate leaders have incentives to benefit stakeholders beyond what would serve shareholder value. So we do kind of a detailed analysis of the incentives of corporate leaders, relying on the literature, on existing evidence, some additional evidence we put forward. We look at compensation arrangements, the labor market, the market for corporate control. And our clear conclusion is that the interests of corporate leaders and shareholders have a robust association between them, not a complete overlap, and many of the people here have worried about this in the past, but there is some substantial association. By contrast, there is no such link between the incentives of corporate leaders and between the interests of corporate leaders and the interests of stakeholders. And therefore, the incentives conclusion is that corporate leaders do not have incentives to protect stakeholders beyond what would serve shareholder value maximization. We take the existing system of incentives largely as given because stakeholderists largely argue for giving corporate leaders discretion to protect stakeholders without changing other basic corporate law rules, changing purpose, but not major other pieces of the corporate structure. But some people, including this audience, might argue that perhaps we could produce better outcomes by supplementing stakeholderism with major changes to the design of compensation arrangements or to the way in which directors are elected and having stakeholders participate in this as well. We examine this and we show that those two types of proposals would be difficult to implement, would produce large costs, and actually the potential benefits for stakeholders would be rather limited. We then turn to putting forward evidence that enables us to learn from the past about the promise of stakeholderism. A good setting for testing, we argue, is provided by the acquisitions of companies in states with constituency statutes, which adopt essentially a stakeholderist regime for M&A transactions and allow corporate leaders to take into account the interests of stakeholders for making decisions with respect to M&A deals. So we analyze all and each and every acquisition agreement in private equity acquisitions of public companies that were governed by constituency statutes during the last 2 decades. We have a companion paper for whom corporate leaders bargain that provides the analysis in full. But let me give you here just the bottom line conclusions. In terms of for whom corporate leaders bargained, we find that corporate leaders bargained for shareholders. They obtained large premiums for them, and they bargained for themselves. They obtained monetary payoffs and often continued employments. But corporate leaders did not bargain for stakeholders. They did not negotiate for constraints on the post-deal freedom to fire employees that the buyer will have. And that's even though constituency statutes were partly justified as a way for protecting labor, and even though there is substantial evidence that in many cases, private equity acquisitions reduce employment. Similarly, they did not negotiate for any protections of suppliers, customers, and creditors. And they did not largely negotiate for protections for headquarter communities, except very small number of cases in which we found cosmetic and non-enforceable pledges to give some protections. Okay, what are the lessons of this evidence for the future? We suggest that stakeholderists must wrestle with the failure of the constituency statutes, identify the reasons for this failure, and examine whether those reasons also would not undermine stakeholderism. We look at various possible reasons, and our conclusion is that the constituency statutes fail to deliver stakeholder benefits due to the incentives of corporate leaders, and that stakeholderism should be expected to fail to deliver its purported benefits for exactly the same reason. We think that we should follow the warning of George Santayana from a century ago, that those who cannot remember the past and those who do not learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. Okay, let me conclude by discussing the perils of stakeholderism. Up to this point, some people might say that even if stakeholderism cannot be expected to benefit stakeholders, if you care about stakeholders and you are concerned about corporate externalities, at least stakeholderism cannot hurt. It can only move things in the right direction, even if marginally. However, we showed that embracing stakeholderism would produce two major costs. First of all, it would lead, and it's perhaps intended by many supporters to lead to increased insulation and reduced accountability of corporate leaders. And it would do it in two ways. Stakeholderism could induce institutional investors, and they are often urged to be more deferential to corporate leaders so that they can serve stakeholders, and less willing to support hedge fund activists and more accepting of governance arrangements that shield management from market pressure. And similarly, stakeholderism could induce policymakers and people who care about stakeholders to accept such insulating arrangements. Indeed, if we look at past experience, there is reasons to be concerned that a desire to obtain increased insulation might at least partly motivate the support for stakeholderism that is expressed these days by corporate leaders and their advisors. Indeed, in the past 4 decades, alleged benefits to stakeholders have been a standard move that was used by management advisors seeking to obtain arrangements that entrench and insulate corporate leaders, as constituency statutes did. The increased insulation and entrenchment of corporate leaders would benefit corporate leaders, but not others. It would hurt shareholders and the economy. Financial economists would largely agree, but also by reducing the total social pie, it would often make stakeholders themselves worse off. The other and perhaps most important cost is that embracing stakeholderism would chill stakeholder-oriented reforms. There is a growing recognition, we count ourselves in this camp, that although corporations have been a major engine for growth, we have to worry about the externalities of capitalism. And there is a wide array of policy reforms, laws, regulations, governmental policies that could be imposed on corporations from the outside, and that would force or incentivize corporations to improve stakeholder treatment and provide real, meaningful, non-illusory benefits to stakeholders. And we worry that embracing stakeholderism would impede such reforms by raising illusory hopes that corporate leaders would protect stakeholders on their own. For example, if you have such expectations, they could well reduce the efforts of those who care about stakeholders to seek such external laws, regulations, and policies that would do real good, and also would make some lawmakers, politicians, and policymakers less receptive to adopting such reforms on grounds that we can expect private ordering and corporate leaders on their own to take care of corporate externalities and largely reduce them without outside intervention. So let me conclude. The benefits of stakeholderism are illusory. Corporate leaders shouldn't be expected to deliver the purported benefits to stakeholders, and in fact, have in the past not done so when they actually had discretion to deliver such benefits. And the costs might well be quite large. Embracing stakeholderism could well impose substantial costs on shareholders and the economy, but also, and not less importantly, on stakeholders themselves that all of us in this conference should worry about. Thanks, and I look forward to your comments and reactions.